I'm excited to talk about the Cleveland Browns with you, dude, because I think this is a pretty solid roster. I think a couple years ago, Dave, maybe everybody was drinking the Kool-Aid a little bit too early, thinking that this was the next best thing when they drafted Baker Mayfield, but it took some time. And they acquired Odell Beckham Jr. He hasn't really found his footing just yet. But the Browns are 16-1 to win the Super Bowl, plus 155 to win the AFC North. To make the playoffs, they are plus 180. If you don't think they're going to win the division and you think that they're going to get in via a wild card, they are plus 220 to get a wild card spot, and their win total is pretty high, Dave, 10.5. Baker Mayfield, QB 19 over in NFFC leagues over the last 2 weeks, ADP of 148. Nick Chubb, RB 10, ADP of 12. Kareem Hunt, RB 26, ADP of 60. Both of those guys were top 12 running backs last season. Odell Beckham Jr., who we mentioned, wide receiver 27, 66 overall. Jarvis Landry, wide receiver 45, ADP 102. And then Donovan Peoples-Jones, wide receiver 87, Dave, last week before his preseason game, and you know the overreaction sometimes preseason. Sometimes you just need to see some of these guys get on the field. He went from wide receiver 145 to 87 in a week from having 5 targets and 3 grabs, and one of those grabs was pretty nice. Before we get into some of their weapons, what do you make overall from this Browns team? Are they legit? Can they get to the Super Bowl?
Oh man, I don't think that they're going to get to the Super Bowl. I think that's a pretty tough task when you look at some of the other teams in the AFC. But this team has gotten really, really good, and they build a team that isn't all that exciting for fantasy purposes. Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt, they're going to have their games, but really, this is a team that's built in the trenches and built on defense. So when we're talking fantasy football, that's not something that a lot of guys think about. And yeah, I think this team could absolutely make a run in the playoffs. But then once you start looking at the teams that the Chiefs have and the Chargers have, I don't know if they are good enough to get over that hurdle. I love the odds that you called out though, plus 180 to make the playoffs. That just seems like an absolute lock. They won 11 games last year and they haven't done anything to make this team worse. So I think that's kind of where you can slot them in this year. So I like the over at 10.5 wins. I like the plus 180 to make the playoffs. I think this is a very, very good team. And it's weird because when you think of good teams in today's NFL, you think you need to have a 4,000-yard passer and a 1,200-yard receiver and, all these things. And the Browns don't have that. But because of that defense and because of the just, smash it in your face run game, they're still going to win games. So I do like this team a lot this year.
And I always say this, Dave, and this is just using our free prop shop over at ftnbets.com, because some sites have like even money minus 150. So if you shop around, you can find plus 180. And I do think that they are a lock for the playoffs. Yeah, it's hard to argue everything that you just said. I know Elliot Chris wrote an article, long shot article of Baker Mayfield being an MVP. And I was thinking to myself, could he really be MVP? Could he throw for 4,000 yards? But this team is so complete that if they do win 11, 12 games and they win the division and Baker Mayfield just, hits all of his wide receivers and his tight ends, and then you're thinking, okay, well, they have the best 1-2 punch maybe in the NFL with these running backs, that maybe Baker could get some MVP votes, but usually you would have to see like 40-plus touchdowns, almost 5,000 yards from a quarterback for him to get some votes. Let's talk about some of those weapons and Baker Mayfield. Is he somebody that you're interested in, maybe a super flex? Would you take him at all as your quarterback too? I find myself passing on him, but maybe I'm wrong here.
I actually have him as my quarterback too in a lot of super flex leagues just because his value is so low that I think he's going to at least finish as a middling QB2. So I really like when I'm drafting in super flex leagues to get 2 of those elite options right off the bat. But sometimes it doesn't always work out that way. And, you take a running back or a tight end early. And when I do that, Baker Mayfield is usually the guy that I'm targeting in rounds 5 and 6. Now, I think we know exactly what we're getting from Baker Mayfield. Like we have both said, I don't think he's ever going to really be a 4,000-yard passer. He's always kind of been between like 3,500, 3,800. But what we saw last year was him having the same amount of pass attempts that he had his rookie season and throwing for less yards, but he threw for almost the same exact touchdown total. The biggest thing, though, is that he cut his interceptions down in half. So they're really kind of making the playbook a little bit easier for him. We already talked about the fact that this dynamic duo that they have in the backfield is really the offense or the engine that runs this offense. And I don't expect that to change. So I don't think that there's any scenario where Baker Mayfield suddenly comes out and starts throwing the ball 550, 600 times a season and is even in the conversation for an MVP. I think that he has the potential to be that on a different offense, but they're catering to him right now. And the way that they built this team, he does play more of that game manager role. And, Odell Beckham's great. We already talked about Donovan Peoples-Jones, who it's funny that we saw this big boost after the preseason game because Donovan Peoples-Jones was pretty darn good last year, and people seem to forget about
Yeah.
that. But no, I mean, realistically, Baker Mayfield, he's a guy that I like as my QB2, but I'm not even looking at him in single quarterback leagues.
Yeah, it's tough for single quarterback leagues. But yeah, I mean, you bring up good points, the completion percentage and the picks, right? 21 interceptions in 2019 and only 8 last season. And, playing a lot of the year without Odell Beckham Jr. So is Odell Beckham Jr., we had a couple people come on this show over the past 2 weeks and saying they are in on OBJ to have that bounce back, and why not around wide receiver 27, the upside to be a wide receiver 1, or we can say at least a wide receiver 2 if he plays 16 games. But Baker and him haven't really been on the same connection, and people in Cleveland think that Baker is better suited without Odell Beckham Jr., that maybe when OBJ was on the field, he was looking his way too much. But I don't know if I agree with that. When you have a stud like Odell Beckham Jr., I think you want him on the field. Do you have any shares of OBJ yet this season?
I do, yeah. And as much as I'd like to take the contrarian take, you said you've talked about OBJ with a few guys and they're all buying. Well, I'm buying too. And I think that, this
Mm-hmm.
overcorrection, we know that he's not the same player that he was in New York. I pulled the numbers. I mean, it's mind boggling what he put up while he was with the Giants. His 16 game pace there was 170 targets per season, 107 receptions, 1,500 yards, and 13 touchdowns, which is, Jerry Rice esque. And then since joining Cleveland, that has dropped to 122 targets, 67 receptions, 940 yards, and 5 touchdowns. But I still don't think that we've seen the best from Odell Beckham. Injuries have really held him back. So I think that he can, we talked about the pace of 942 yards and 5 touchdowns. I think that he increases that a little bit this year. So if you can get him as wide receiver 27 and he can just improve up to, 1,000 yards and 6 touchdowns, he's paying off at that ADP. I think that he still is going to outperform his ADP as wide receiver 27. I don't think that he has that wide receiver 1 upside anymore because of how much this team runs the ball. But people are so quick to talk about how Kevin Stefanski just wants to run the ball. And that's absolutely true. But people are quick to forget that just in 2018, when Kevin Stefanski was in Minnesota, Kirk Cousins supported 2 wide receiver 1s. So it can happen here. I don't know if it will because of Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt, but there is still a ceiling for wide receivers in a Kevin Stefanski offense.
Yeah, wide receiver 27 over the last 2 weeks. Good call on Stefanski in Minnesota. Chase Claypool, Jamar Chase, Brendan Ayuk, T. Higgins, Kenny Galladay, Jerry Jeudy, Juju Smith-Schuster, Robbie Anderson, kind of in around that range. I think his days of being a wide receiver 1 is over, but maybe not. Like if he left Cleveland, like if he just left Cleveland and went to a situation where it was like the Giants and he was just the guy in a happy, pass happy offense potentially. But it is run heavy, which you alluded to, playing to the strengths of Kevin Stefanski, a very strong offensive line and arguably the best 1-2 punch in football. So let's talk about that backfield in Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. Last year, Nick Chubb, 16.5 fantasy points per game in a half-point setting was the 7th best mark, and Kareem Hunt, 12.5 in a half-point setting as well, 21. But overall, both of these guys finished as top 12 running backs. Nick Chubb, man, you're paying a price for this guy. What do you make of this backfield?
I am not too crazy about this backfield because I feel like both of their values are inflated because of what we saw last year. And I don't know if these guys are going to finish that high again this year. Nick Chubb, the player, is one of the best running backs in the NFL. I mean, he is a poor man's Derrick Henry. He's a fantastic runner. He's got vision, balance, speed, agility, strength. He does everything you want to see in a running back. But having Kareem Hunt there really severely limits his ceiling. So I think that if these guys were to part ways, I think Nick Chubb, realistically, without Kareem Hunt on this team, would be in the conversation with Christian McCaffrey, Dalvin Cook, Alvin Kamara as a top tier running back. But he's only averaged 2.2 targets per game since being drafted in Cleveland. And in PPR leagues, that's something that I don't want anything to do with. And I'm kind of fading Derrick Henry for similar reasons. And it's not that I don't like Nick Chubb, the player, it's that I hate his situation. And then similarly, Kareem Hunt, we saw what he did a few years ago in Kansas City. He was absolutely electric, took the league by storm as a rookie, but now being in a limited role in Cleveland, it limits his ceiling as well. So I think both of these guys benefit from each other. We actually saw Kareem Hunt. He had a decent sample size last year without Nick Chubb. He saw more touches in those games, but he averaged fewer fantasy points in those games. So they do benefit from each other being on the field, but unfortunately, by lifting each other's floors, they are lowering each other's ceilings. And with Nick Chubb right now getting drafted in the late first, early second round, I don't want anything to do with him at that ADP.
You kind of break my heart a little bit, but you bring up good points. In a PPR league, he's a definite pass. But it is hard to argue what you're saying because you have the skill set of Chubb, and what you said I think is spot on. Like one of the best pure runners in the game, elusive, right there with Derrick Henry. The offensive line is very strong. He's still able to rack up 1,000 yards and missing 4 games. And is he a touchdown per game guy? Probably not. But over the course of his career, 5.3 yards per carry. Man, I was bummed when they got Kareem Hunt because this is somebody that I think could catch out of the backfield. He had 36 grabs on 49 targets in 2019. But when Hunt was acquired, he just came in and took all of those targets away, which you alluded to. I mean, it's all of the catches. But one thing I noticed towards the end of the season was that Hunt, when he took over when Chubb was hurt, he was getting all those touches. He wasn't as efficient. And I think a lot of people in the industry just assumed he would be a lock and loaded RB1. And he probably would be on any other team. If he was just on Cleveland over the course of the season, if there was no Chubb, I'm sure he would be an RB1. I'd rank him that way, and I'm sure he just said it.
Yeah.
I think you would rank him that way. And if Chubb was anywhere else, we'd all rank him. Like these are 2 stud running backs. But I noticed the catches and the targets started to come down, and the touches started to come down overall. I don't know if that was an injury that popped up for Hunt, if he was maybe they were just scaling back a little bit because he was getting a lot of work when Chubb was out. But overall, in terms of just catches per game, it was only 1 more catch per game than Chubb. But the fact that he is still hanging around, and also that he had more red zone rushing opportunities. And sometimes when you're watching Cleveland, Dave, it's not a lock that Chubb's going to get the red zone carries. And that's an issue if you're going to draft a running back in the first or end of the first. If it's not Chubb being a lock to get those carries, it's like, oh man, Hunt's really ticking me off today because Chubb should get these carries. If you're not in on Chubb, are you in on Hunt, or are you just avoiding it altogether?
I do like Hunt at his ADP because I think that he can outperform that. But usually when he's getting drafted in the 5th, 6th, 7th round, I'm looking for guys that have really high ceilings. And I don't know if Hunt really has that high of a ceiling. Like you said, we saw it last year where he wasn't really all that inefficient when he was getting almost 18 carries per game. So Hunt's a guy that I'm not too crazy about. I was acquiring a ton of shares a while back, hoping that he'd get traded out of Cleveland and be that bell cow back somewhere. I think there's so many teams that could benefit from somebody like Kareem Hunt. Imagine him in Miami or imagine him in Buffalo. Like he could be a stud, but we're just not going to see it happen here in Cleveland. So, I've acquired some shares of Kareem Hunt. Just on the off chance that something happens to Nick Chubb. And when I'm going, wide receiver heavy early in my draft, Kareem Hunt is a guy that I like to take. But realistically, if I'm, this is over the course of hundreds of best ball leagues that I've drafted some Kareem Hunt. But if I'm in a league that's important to me, my home league, Kareem Hunt's somebody that realistically isn't even on my radar. And neither is Nick Chubb in PPR leagues.
Yeah, you bring up good points, dude. You bring up good points. I'm just such a big Nick Chubb fan. I do have some shares in half-point settings.
I really am.
But the fact that he has kind of, settled in around the end of the first, it's a little rich because it is a committee after all. And like we said, and we've kind of come full circle here, is that it is a very strong 1-2 punch, but he is not a lock to get those touches. And I wonder what we saw towards the end, if it was and into the playoffs, if they are going to give this guy 20 plus touches and maybe 1 or 2 catches in the backfield. But Hunt is such a good running back that he deserves to be on the field, and he's a mismatch, and and something out of Cleveland that I read last week was that the fact that they're adding 1 more game to the schedule, and that it's important to have, multiple backs on your team because, aspirations of a playoff squad here, wanting to take the next step and beat a Kansas City, beat a Baltimore, and get, deeper into the playoffs, is that maybe they just will scale it back from Chubb and really have a 1-2 punch committee where it's not 50-50, but maybe it's 60-40, maybe it's 70-30. And there's not a lot of running backs going inside the first round that are having a 70-30 split. And if he's one of those guys, I can see why you and others maybe should avoid him.